Welcome back to Open Your Eyes, and we're now moving into our first segment. We've got in with us a CARIMAC UWI lecturer, and he'll be addressing social media regulations, media literacy, and misinformation. And these misinformation are often, well, as a matter of fact, extremely oftenly posted on social media. Stefan Campbell is in with us. He is the assistant lecturer, CARIMAC UWI Mona campus. Stefan, morning, my brother.
Good morning, how are you doing?
Everything nice. Wet morning in the city, but nonetheless, we're doing okay, my brother. So let's jump on into this conversation. This is definitely a very important conversation to have, and we need to address it, especially for the fact that social media now, especially over this pandemic and people being at home, have become, like you mentioned out of the commercial break, a new country. Everybody flocked to to many or various platforms to try and get themselves information. They get misinformed and they get disinformed. So let's jump on there, brother. When we say this, what do we mean by it?
I think, so first and foremost, for some context, the Facebook population is almost 3 billion.
Wow.
Right? Instagram is over 1 billion, and WhatsApp is close to 2 billion. And I'm saying that because it's one company that owns 3 of the largest social media entities on the planet.
Yeah.
And when you put that in context, the closest country to that is China. But the difference is, it's not just the amount of people, it's the connectivity, one, to a range of material, media material, people, and all of those things. And there is also the ability to have tailor-fitted experiences. So you two might be sitting beside each other looking at 2 different streams of content, right? But I think we assume, and this is something I say all the time, it's social media doesn't necessarily mean that it's sociable media. Right? It's social because we can interact, but it doesn't necessarily mean sociable and always positive. There are some positive things that you can glean from it, but it is not always positive. And I think you all made mention of the example of the first thing you do when you wake up in the morning, you grab your phone, you go on Facebook. If the first thing you see is bad news, then it sets the tone for the rest of your day. But it's not just that. The algorithm detects that this is the type of content that you look at first and more often, and it continues to push this type of material to you day after day after day after day. And so the issue arises when you continue to consume that content. What happens to you? The other issue is, what if that information is wrong? Then you are creating a worldview, a paradigm, a perspective that is not actually based on facts, but motivates and moves you to do the things or believe the things that you do.
So I know that you're a journalism lecturer, correct? Media.
Yes.
Right. So you're a journalism lecturer in the realm of social media. What do you understand in terms of what the regulations are on media houses that have social media platforms in terms of the information they share? Are those information regulated?
So this is one of the biggest discussions now, because you have regulators, broadcast, for example, the Broadcasting Commission in Jamaica that regulates broadcast entities. But there's not necessarily any regulatory body for something like print or even for social media. So the registered organizations, or for example, the media houses that utilize social media, they have the social media is essentially an extension of the company that already exists. And so they have a greater interest or need in order to ensure that the information they put out is factual and it's valid. So that is sort of a preventative measure and a preventative factor. It doesn't always work. What happens though is that because we all share the same platform, it is easy, and I see it often, it is easy for someone to, for example, to craft a logo that's similar to Open Your Eyes, that already has a credible background, use the same font, use the same design, and put out false and fake content. And because we are so used to seeing this type of framing, we assume that it's factual. And then it becomes an issue when something that is false or framed as fact gets picked up by an established organization and or established media house and amplifies it. And because you're used to seeing credible content on a platform, then we automatically assume that this information is factual as well. There was a Latin American and Caribbean survey done a few years back. They do it every once in a while, and it says that oftentimes we trust the media more than we trust politicians, and we trust we trust the church, right? But if it is that the information in the media is erroneous, what are the implications? Let's amplify that. Oftentimes we trust what we see on social media because we assume that someone would have gone through the process of ensuring that it's factual because it's posted. We assume that everyone is all good and fair because some of us are fair, so that we don't question, we don't fact check, and then we parrot this information. I don't know how many times it happens to you. Someone shares a YouTube link on WhatsApp and it's forwarded multiple times, and no one questions if this thing is factual. And I've had to do it in so many groups. I had to go to a fact-checking site quickly and post it and says, this is not a credible website. It looks credible, it looks pretty, the person is saying all the things that you want to hear, because that's another telltale sign. You are already stuck in an information loop where you only get a certain type of information. So when someone else gives you the type of information that confirms your biases, you automatically assume that it's true.
You know what? While you're saying that, it reminds me of yesterday's big social media situation in Belize, where a media house, or a print media, actually put out a story that said that there is information that a tacos vendor has been shut down because that tacos vendor actually put toilet paper to stretch the amount of meat that the person can sell. And that thing, this is what exactly what we're talking about. That thing ran like wildfire, so much so that it hit all the media houses and primarily social media, and just went from there. People were starting to question the situation, question the ministry with who does these checks. And so exactly what you're alluding to at this particular point. And just like Paul mentioned, though, which he asked if they should be regulated, or the next question from that, my brother, is should it be free for all in terms of social media?
Well, and again, this is one of the other tricky things, because think about it. The entity, so we use social media, but we don't have we don't own it. And if anyone considered reading the terms of agreements, and I don't think many of us actually do, you realize that the information that you post there is not necessarily yours. You get some gratification from the likes and the follows and all of those things, but essentially you are a marketplace for advertisers to shop and to pick and to choose. And so how do you regulate a marketplace that does not exist in your borders and in your jurisdictions? And mind you, some countries, some European countries have put certain regulations in place for Facebook to ensure that they don't share certain types of content, or increase in taxes or penalties and fees and fines. But very few countries, especially developing countries, do that. So how do you regulate such a large entity, private entity as well? It's not a public, it's not a government-owned entity. So the regulations are very, very difficult. Plus, embedded in many of our constitutions is this idea that we have freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and all of those things. But very rarely does it get to the courts, where, and you know, usually the courts are the ones that balance the rights and ensuring that one person's rights don't encroach on another person's rights, which is why this Facebook whistleblower is such a big thing, because now you have a whistleblower bringing it to bringing it in the context of one of the most powerful countries on the planet, and they are now discussing whether we should have more regulations and how do we regulate without infringing on their rights. But the other thing that we fail to realize is not just freedom of expression and freedom of opinion. This is about profit.
Yeah.
And oftentimes we forget that when it comes down to it, it's called capitalism for a reason. It's not humanism. And oftentimes the purpose of making money supersedes the everyday rights of the individual. And that's the ultimate argument. Because if a political party or political group is benefiting from the way things are, there's very little reason for them to want to regulate something that they're benefiting from.
Would you speak a bit to how Facebook would perhaps make a profit from misinformation?
So this is the thing. So let me give you an example of the traditional media, regular television. You know, advertisers pay the TV station for the eyes and the ears that they bring, right? The media industry, interestingly, is one of the few industries where the consumers are not necessarily the ones that are doing the purchasing. The advertisers pay to run the organization. Now we have subscriptions and all of those things, but traditionally, you would be looking at free-to-air television and you're not paying anything outside of the TV that you buy. And so you are consuming the content, but you're not necessarily paying for it. Amplify that times 100,000. That's what happens on many social media platforms, right? Yeah. The information that when you sign up and you put in that demographic information, that is sold to advertisers. The more times you click on a certain type of content, the algorithm packages that type of information and sells it to advertisers. So when you go on the other side, the advertising side, you can pick, choose, and refuse. I don't know if it happens to you. You're scrolling through Instagram, you're scrolling through Facebook, and you're thinking about something, and then you see an ad for it. Yes. That's not God. That's not Holy Ghost. That's the algorithm. Because we like to think that we are spontaneous, but realistically speaking, almost every human being has some type of pattern. Yes. Based on your demographic and your psychographic information and the type of information, the type of content that you consume, they can highly recommend, and chances are 9 out of 10 times they are right. And even when you say, no, you're not interested, that is information that they can use. So they say, all right, he doesn't like this, how about this? Yeah. until they get it right, and that information is built up and that is sold to the highest bidder. Yeah. So I think we need to acknowledge that this thing is not all good, right? It's not saying that it's all bad, but that level of awareness to be able, and some platforms and some devices actually now allow you to choose what apps track you, right? So it will actually ask you now, the iPhone will ask you, do you want this app to track you? And you can say no. That is a huge step, because before you were not able to make that choice. Right? Before, all the information, all the content, and again, because we never read the terms of agreement, we just assume that it's ours, it's our space, it's your profile, but it's not necessarily yours. So,
Steph, I want to piggyback on what my brother here said with respect to misinformation. The question is is this: how to verify information posted and the possible repercussions?
So it is, and when we teach things like media literacy, and media literacy essentially looks at how to critique certain types of content, how to create certain type of content, how to analyze yourself to figure out if this thing has an impact on me, and if it has an impact on me, why, and my own beliefs and all of those things. So the first thing you need to consider on social media, if there is any content, it's always good. So you see a new story that is released. It's not verified. It's a new account. Somebody says something, and it's not on what we would consider the reputable media platforms. Now, sometimes it means that there is a delay in the content getting there, but the reality is regulated media houses, and we teach a master's in media management as well that teaches how to balance, profit with ensuring that you maintain your ethics, right? And one of the ethical standards is ensuring accuracy. So even though it's posted on Facebook, you sometimes need to check the reputable media houses to ensure that that information is there, because they have a greater stake. They don't want to lose their license, or they don't want to get sued for defamation and all of these things. So they have a greater interest in ensuring that information is factual. The average citizen, I'm not saying that somebody just gets up and posts wrong information, and there's a difference between misinformation and disinformation.
Yes.
Misinformation, the information is wrong. Disinformation is the intent to deceive, right? And because all of this exists on the same platforms, you have to do your fact checking. Now, there are fact checking websites where you can go on to just type in. I usually type in the name of the entity, if it is framing itself as a Facebook entity or as a social media news entity. Type it in. Look at the other stories that they've put out. And one of the telltale signs, when somebody puts out information and they say, do your own research, oftentimes they don't have the information. But because we see do your own research, we think that, yeah, this person definitely did their research. So they're telling me to do my own research. Now, it is good to do your own research, but don't look for the information on the same platform where you are getting the potential disinformation. That's the funny thing, because you look at one Facebook user and then you look at another Facebook user, and because the other Facebook user disagrees, but they disagree, they're disagreeing with the point that you already disagree with. You use that as confirmation. That's not how it works. So I think we are using search engines and all of those things less and less. We are actually locking ourselves, as I said, in that information loop or misinformation loop, assuming that we are getting more information isn't necessarily more accurate information. And I think everyone needs to approach it with some air of skepticism from the very beginning. How I see it, unfortunately, majority of social media content I view as guilty until proven innocent. Yeah. Not the other way around. Because I do not jump or rush to share something. Okay. There's this case, I don't know if you're all paying attention to it, but this religious cult in Jamaica, the story religious cult where 3 people died and all of those things. Yes. And there was a flurry of YouTube videos posted and saying that the head of the church actually died. And then a few hours later, the traditional or the reputable media houses released their stories saying that he's actually in jail. And then when you look at the comments, people say, but I thought he died, but I thought he died, but I thought he died. So it's very interesting that it's so easy for someone to post without any repercussions that nobody is willing to do those checks and balances. Anybody can say what they want. And then the other thing is, once someone says something that sounds factual and then they end with, it's just my opinion, come on, man. Or
or how reputable that person is, and and so when you talk about misinformation, disinformation, the reputability of an individual speaks to what the population actually will be believing in, and that's one of the things, because and it reminds me of the entire vaccination process and vaccination situation. Definitely. We continue to say, hey, if you want the information, you go to whose website? The World Health Organization. Right. They'll tell you exactly what best, to look forward to.
But so this is the interesting thing. Oftentimes we believe information based on what exists in our current worldview or belief system, right? And oftentimes, because we are familiar with people, chances are we would believe what they're saying before. How many people paid attention to the World Health Organization before this pandemic? How many people actively looked at the WHO or listened to the WHO in order to get their information? So now that somebody is presenting it as good or bad or whatever, you are going based on that person's perception, especially if you were not aware of it. And one of the arguments people talk about, especially when it comes to the vaccine, is that they made it too quick, right? And then you have to ask, so what's that? So if they made it too quick, you have an issue. If they made it too slow, you would have had an issue as well. And not realizing that the technology and the science was there long before. And so whatever modifications they had to make would have made it easier, quicker for it to get to the market or get to the citizen. But it's based on what we already believe. If there is already an existing mistrust of a system or a group of people, the additional information that supports that mistrust that is pushed by the algorithm makes it hard for people to come out of that cycle. So very hard for people to come out of that cycle. And that's why sometimes it's good to step away from it for a while. Because when you get caught in that loop, you believe it or not, there is this documentary called The Social Dilemma on Netflix. I would encourage everybody to watch that. You don't realize how easy it is for you to get stuck in that cycle and not have access to any other type of information. Very, very easy.
Yeah. So, Steph, with respect to, journalism and the entire media, especially, let's speak to journalists. And Paul is one of those folks, but we're talking here in general. How do they, or what would be great steps for them to not to misguide themselves and to follow the better processes of getting information? Would you say there are steps to these things?
No, we can't ignore that sometimes you get the best information or first-hand information from social media, right? And there's this idea, this discussion about citizen journalism. Some people agree that it's something, others would say that it does not exist because the journalist is him or herself a citizen. So the idea that an untrained individual can just get up and publish a news story is just like saying somebody who has a scalpel and a sphygmanometer can go and become a doctor, right? And so there's this issue of who decides to call themselves a journalist. But for the journalist who is experienced or trained, when you get that first information, the first thing you have to do is verify. You have to verify. Have there been multiple witnesses, multiple sources, right? Can you confirm? If someone quotes information and says that 1 million people have died from the vaccine, what does that mean? That is scary. When you say from the vaccine, are you saying because some people died after the vaccine that there is a direct correlation to the vaccine? Because cause and effect and correlation is two different things. So how stories are framed can also be very misleading and be very dangerous. So one, fact checking. Two, be very careful how you frame your stories. And three, you need to be honest enough to admit, let's say you got some bad information or you published something in the wrong way, to admit that you are sorry, do the damage control, do the apologies, and make sure you get it right, right? So that's what it is. And because it's so reflexive, in addition to the fact that a lot of media houses have a system of fact checking, so it's not just a journalist, it's the editor-in-chief. So because it goes through so many channels, right? And also you have the legal section where oftentimes we have to run it by them to ensure that it's not defamatory, right? Yeah. Because of all of these checks and balances, chances are when your story comes out, you have protections and you can also verify and you have other people to corroborate that this is actually factual. And when it changes, then we would give you an update. But not just to say 3 people died in this event and what you're referencing is a social media account. And that's the only source that they're using, right? And so those are the things that I would encourage. I mean, I think the experienced journalists already know this, but for aspiring journalists as well, this is something, and not just aspiring journalists, I think for everyone who uses any social medium, you need to incorporate this idea that yes, you want to help, but how do you help with information that is wrong or erroneous? And by the way, pointing a camera does not automatically make you a journalist. There was this big story yesterday, I can't remember which state it happened, where this lady was being raped on a train, and people took their cameras out and posted. And not one person decided to call 911 or intervene.
Happened in New York.
Thank you. That does not make you a journalist. That makes you a very irresponsible and inconsiderate citizen, right? And now they are thinking about charging those individuals for being complicit as well. So some information, you need to be able to determine and distinguish what information helps and what information hurts. And ultimately, we look at being a voice for those who are unable to speak and represent themselves. And because of that, you have to ensure that your information is as close to the truth as possible.
Steph, I don't want, we know that time is dwindling just like that, but I want to take this opportunity to ask you about your thoughts in terms of parenting and social media, and how to do checks and balances there.
And so this one is a heavy one, because again, we oftentimes, so different generations are punctuated by different types of media. One generation was raised by the radio and there were issues with that. One generation by the television, and now this generation is literally being raised by the internet, and not just the internet as a body, all the subgroups, the television or video-based platforms, the Twitter, the Instagram, the whatnot, and the what have you. And I think parenting cannot be a passive process with social media. So you can't just assume that because the child has a device, that the child is only going to be looking at positive things. You need to actively pay attention to what that child is consuming, and not just pay attention and shut it down, because again, my generation, we will cut it out. Your parents are looking at something bad, they probably throw the whole TV away. It's about having the conversation about what does this mean, right? And so my area is looking at, so for PhD, I'm looking at suicide among Caribbean men, and how potentially the content that we consume, and that's one of the things that the whistleblower revealed, that social media is actually making people more suicidal. And more people, and the majority of those people are adolescent girls primarily.
Yeah.
Right? Because their body image, they don't feel beautiful, they feel like they're not achieving anything. So you need to have these conversations to essentially counteract those negative effects. So you can't just take away the device, right? Even if the child views something that is potentially dangerous, you have to have this conversation. This is dangerous because you are helping that child shape a healthy self-image and also a healthy worldview, which also means that you have to pay attention to the information that you are also getting, because you can't inform the child, and our children these days know more than we do. How can you inform the child if you don't know what to inform them on or about? Yeah. How can you tell a child that they need to discern between fact and fiction if you yourself can't tell the difference? Right? And also there are different, so YouTube allows you to regulate what type of content. Different platforms allow you to regulate content. Some devices allow parental control and all of those things. But still, when the child goes to school or the child interacts with peers, they can still get the information. So we cannot assume that because we tell them not to, or we have these controls, that they still don't have access. Yeah. Remember the figures that I gave you. So it's so pervasive, it's everywhere. Yeah. Right. So how do you counteract this information with the positive information, the beneficial information, to ensure that they are not stuck in that information loop, that negative loop? They're not questioning their self-image, or they're not assuming that the world is all evil and all cruel and all of these things.
And Steph, as you say that, I could just imagine the cringing of parents, because look, at this particular point, especially across the world, man, I wanted to say here in Belize, but across the world, these things are open to everybody. These things are open to children, and with the onset of the pandemic, everybody just went on a device rant. It's just on the device. That's where they do school. That's where they live their life. That's where they get music. That's where they get entertainment. But would you say there are sites that parents could actually drive their children to, so they're better led in a positive way? Because that's Facebook world. Oh man.
So this is the thing, and again going back to the algorithm. If you continue to allow your child to view positive things on the platform, then the algorithm is going to respond in that way. Perfect. Right? Every once in a while, some negative thing they're going to try to test to see what's the uptake on all of these things. But that's why you have YouTube Kids, and YouTube has these regulations. So that information that is available to that child, chances are, is a lot more positive than other types of information. It doesn't mean you should take it you should take it for granted. And it doesn't mean that social media in and of themselves are negative. I see it as a tool, right? And in the same way a hammer can be used to pound a nail, the same way a hammer can be used as a murder weapon.
Yes.
You need to understand how it works in order to determine what's the best use. And I think ultimately, if people don't remember anything else, don't assume that these things are passive, open, free, and positive. They are tools to be utilized, and you need to understand how these tools should be utilized and what's the best use of them, right?
Yeah.
So they will be helpful as long as you understand the how and as long as you understand the potential positive and the negative. And that only then can we become a healthy society or a healthy country of Facebook or Instagram or WhatsApp users.
I think one of the things we see in this day and age with social media is the divide it seems to be creating, especially in this day and age, among opinions and between different people. So it's the anti-vaxxers versus the vaxxers, it's racism, political issues, political views. Any thoughts on how, and really I think it's just a reflection on social media of perhaps the divides we have in society, in real life, and the differing opinions. But one of the things that social media flags or speaks to is hate speech. Where, how does social media draw the line, or where do you draw the line to say this is no longer an opinion or a position, but this becomes hate speech?
So think about it. I'm sure there are certain slangs or there are certain derogatory terms in Belize that may not exist in Europe, for example. And because this is a global company, right? Global company that has to determine and decide on an individual basis and also a collective basis what is hate speech, what is good, what is bad. It does not necessarily translate into capturing every single example. So plus the hate actually is shared more and engaged with more. So you mentioned the fact that it could be a reflection of our society. Yes. So we say it's a mirror to society, but it's not. It's a fun mirror. You know, when you go to the circus and the image is amplified, that's exactly what happens. There are differences, but when these differences are repeatedly shown to you, these differences are amplified in your mind and you believe that this is what exists. It's a theory called the cultivation theory. And it speaks to the idea that the world is meaner than we think because we always consume negative, evil, and bad information. And because of that, the individuals so there were always disagreements between groups and all of these things. But now you have a community of people who disagree with the same things that you disagree with. So you have support for your negative, racist, sexist, whatever views, so that you feel emboldened by this support to continue to put out that information. And then, you know, they say you are what you eat. So the more information like this you consume, is the more you become this. And it's the less of the other side that you get to hear from. And it's the less you interact with the other side. And it's the more you dehumanize that other side. And then, as another thing the whistleblower pointed out, is that many times Facebook entered a country shortly after there was some type of civil war, some type of unrest. It's because we have dehumanized these polarizing groups.
Wow.
And we assume that anything that we can do to that side is going to be warranted. That's where it becomes a problem. So it's not saying that differences or divisions never existed. It's just that it's amplified now. And when it's amplified, then it leads to communities of hate, not just hate speech, but communities of hate. And then these communities of hate get further support, and then they get funding, and then they become an established entity. And when they become an established entity, it's easier to recruit others because they say, all right, well, this is a legitimate company. So they're probably saying some good things, because if they were not saying the right things, then they would not have had that support, and then the cycle continues. And so the speech is a small part of it. But when hate becomes institutionalized, and we realize that's happening now. When hate becomes institutionalized, in organizations and in groups, it becomes harder for it to be controlled. Plus, no one is necessarily putting in the Facebook group name, "I hate black people." It's usually something more concealed, like the patriots. And so the patriots by themselves don't necessarily say anything negative.
Yeah.
Right, but but the deeper meaning and the information and the websites that they share and all of those things, those are the things that cultivate a certain type of hate beyond just the mere speech. So that's where it gets dangerous. So one, Facebook and certain entities benefit from this type of hate under the guise of under the guise of freedom of expression. Two, when it becomes institutionalized and certain lessons are learned and people are radicalized and all of these things, it's hard to break out of that loop and it's hard to break out of that institution. Because think about it. When you become part of, for the vaxxers or the anti-vaxxers, I'm using that as an example because these are the two most social media polarized groups now.
At this point,
when you have committed your life, because this is what it seems like, to becoming an anti-vaxxer, the moment you decide that you're going to take the vaccine, you're going to be ostracized. And that feeling of being ostracized from everybody you know and love is why a lot of people would stay in groups. When you talk about groupthink and all of these things, stay in groups, stay in belief systems that don't necessarily benefit them, but for the sake of acceptance, they would continue to perpetuate and parrot certain talking points in order to validate or convince themselves that this thing is the way to go. And then we look at the other person like, how dare you not believe this? And that does not further any argument. Because you're not putting forward anything new.
All right, Steph. Man, you've opened our eyes to a lot of things here about social media, what to do, what not to do. We want to thank you so very much, Stephen Campbell, for joining us this morning from sunny Jamaica.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right, there you go. We're about to take a break. When we come back, of course, we'll be chit-chatting about the Belize Leadership Summit. It's actually the Global Leadership Summit Belize. And folks will begin to tell us about what to expect with this summit and how to prepare yourself for it. And, of course, for life. They'll be in with us in just a few. Stay with us. We'll be back.